The year is 2007. Sri Lanka's civil war had been going on for about 25 years at this point, but things were about to change. The eastern commander of the Tamil Tigers had defected to the government, and so the balance of power had shifted dramatically. And the government used that as an opportunity to make a big push against the Tamil Tigers. I arrived in Sri Lanka as a young journalist, sporting a safari shirt and a luscious head of hair. But I wasn't there to cover the war. I was there to just do one story. As part of this big push by the army, what they would do is shell villages with artillery. Everyone from that village would flee, and then they would move in the ground troops. Everyone from that village became refugees. They went to refugee camps, and so did their children. Those children would miss out on schooling, they would fall behind the education, and often they would never catch up. This would lead to lifelong missed opportunities, which would lead to resentment, and that resentment was one of the things that fueled the cycle of violence in Sri Lanka. I was there to cover a UNICEF program that New Zealand was helping to fund. What this program did was they would go to the refugee camps before the refugees themselves arrived, and they would set up makeshift schools, complete with desks and school materials and even school uniforms, so that by the time the refugees arrived, all the children of the village, as well as the teachers that fled along with them, they would be ready to start school from day one. It was such a clever, simple idea. And it changed my preconceptions about aid as something that kept refugees fed from one day to the next. This was about their future. This was about their development as human beings. And it was also about being a circuit breaker in the bigger picture, in the cycle of violence. One principal told me a story of teachers who had gone back into war zones to salvage material for their kids to help them teach, and who had lost their lives doing so. That was how much education meant to them, and this was the kind of help that we were able to provide. So that was the most worthy story that I'd ever done. I wrote it up, and I pitched it back to one of the major magazines back in New Zealand. And I was all like, no big deal, just, went into Tamil Tiger territories the other day, talked my way past a couple of checkpoints and, a bit of artillery, but, all fine. And I was so confident that I could talk them up to paying me 60 cents a word, which would have added to around $1,200. A four-figure paycheck for a freelance journalist was a big deal. And they said they'd get back to me, and so I waited and waited. By the fifth day of waiting, I had really lost my swagger. I didn't really understand what was going on. They came back and they said no, and so I scrambled around for another buyer, and one newspaper said they didn't have an international budget, another said that they'd already done a story on Sri Lanka that month. Basically, nobody cared, and I ended up selling the story to another international publication. I'm not presenting this as a reason for you guys to hate the media. I'm just trying to explain why I did. I was an idealistic young journalist, and I felt like I was the proud inheritor of this tradition of journalism. I felt like I joined like a secret society to fight evil, and I'd already taken the vow of poverty. That was a prerequisite. But I just completed my first mission, and I felt this like overwhelming sense of vocation, that this was what I wanted to do with my life. And it's at that exact moment that I find out, actually, the secret society that I joined, it was about writing stories on house prices and school zones and brain health. That really shook me to the core. And that was the moment that I thought, I just want to burn this whole thing down. I had a theory, you see, that advertising was the problem. Advertising meant that deep and meaningful reader engagement didn't matter as long as you got people to buy the magazine or to click on the link. And that was commercial reality. You couldn't just insist that editors and publishers do something else. They were just going along with the system. In order to change their behavior, we had to change the incentives and the systems themselves. The thing that I envisaged was just to give the story away. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that if you framed journalism as economic transaction between readers and journalists, then you're encouraging readers to think about the private benefit to themselves. How much entertainment are they getting out of that specific article? What knowledge are they getting, and what is that worth to them? And the point of public good journalism is that the good is public, that it's about keeping our institutions honest, that it's about giving voice to the voiceless. And if we wanted a system that was capable of funding public good journalism, it needs to be able to tap into that public value. In this model, the readers were the patrons of journalism, rather than eyeballs to be sold to advertisers. If I'd been giving this talk in 2007, I would probably have gone with something like, hey guys, I've got this great idea. I call it crowdfunding. But it was 2007, and the world wasn't ready for crowdfunding. That the culture of participation was just in its infancy, and the culture of paying for things was even further behind. And I wasn't ready. I needed to become a better journalist. I needed to produce work that people would feel was worthy to pay for. So I figured that it was going to take years to get from where I was to where I wanted to be. And I needed to find a way of surviving this transition period. And so I retrained as a data visualization developer and started my own business. And in between projects, I would do journalism. I jokingly described it as Batman journalism because it felt like I was living a double life, that I was, working during the day to fund my projects during the night. But over time, that actually started to take hold in terms of my identity and my sense of self. And I became further and further alienated from the norms, the cultures, and the conventions of journalism. Now, for better or worse, those norms and those conventions, they act as constraints on how we behave. And they become ways of grounding ourselves and keeping us accountable. And sure, sometimes they kept us grounded in stupid practices, and sometimes they made us accountable to douchebags, but I was staring out into the void. I was in this position where the only douchebag that I was accountable to was myself. Let me give you an example. So the story which I'm most well known for is the Wynn's kiosk story. I got tipped off that there was a security flaw in Wynn systems, and so I went down to a local Wynn's office and I stood in front of a kiosk for half a day and downloaded about thousands of documents from their corporate servers. By any account, that was a great story. It was a very successful story. That I was headline news everywhere for days, and there were government inquiries and reports, and it was a crowdfunding success as well. I'd raised about $5,700 from that story, about 7 or 8 times what I would have made had I sold that story as a freelance journalist. But something didn't sit right with me with that story. It played into the tropes, the rituals of gotcha journalism, that I'd embarrassed the government felt embarrassed, and so they felt like they had to be seen to be doing something. So instead of doing the cheap, simple, and rational thing of disconnecting their corporate servers from their customer-facing kiosks, what they did was they spent a ludicrous amount of money putting gold-plated security on the kiosks themselves. That wasn't what I wanted to achieve. But when I thought about it, I realized that I kind of knew that was how this whole thing was going to play out. I kind of saw that coming, but I did it anyway. I didn't exactly feel bad about it afterwards. I guess I just doubted. When I had my I want to burn this down moment in Sri Lanka, that was all about pushing back against my failures. But following that path, it's led me to the point where I'm pushing back against my failures, my successes, and everything in between. I was pushing back against journalistic convention, against reader expectations, even against my own impulses. I know it sounds stressful and depressing, but it's not really like that. It's mostly just really time-consuming. But what I want to say is that it's also really necessary. That in order to do something that is radically different, that diverges from convention, you kind of have to just open the airlock and jump out. And then you're in this vacuum where you no longer have any of that to keep you constrained. And the only way to stay sane in that environment is with constant re-examination and self-doubt. That's the lesson that I've really learned from complete independence. And that's also why I'm torn. The time is ripe for crowdfunding journalism to become a real mainstream thing. And it's calling out to me. It's calling out to me because it's about becoming part of something bigger and about being accountable to something that I value. But the journey that has taken me to this point has changed me. And now I'm not sure if I can do that anymore or if I even still want to. I'm sorry to leave you on this really uncertain and ambiguous note, but that's where I live now, ambiguity and uncertainty.